afternoon, everyone. Welcome back after lunch. I'm very excited to be here. I'm assuming many of you have heard about the FDA. How many of you know that FDA does research? Can you raise your hands for me, please? Okay, so that's a pretty good amount. I'm very happy to hear that. There have been audiences where maybe 2 people have raised their hands. So one of the things I hope to communicate to you today is what we're doing to advance in silico medicine. I actually had a colleague yesterday ask me, what is in silico? So maybe some people aren't familiar with that term. In silico actually means on silicon. We have in vivo evidence, we have in vitro evidence. Are we moving to a place where we can think about in silico evidence? So I hope to convince you of that today. So we're going to talk a bit about our partnerships and how our partnerships are really helping us to take simulation to the next level to really impact patient care. So I'm going to tell you about that. I'm going to talk to you about virtual patients and the concepts of in silico clinical trials and what's involved behind that. And then I'm going to share with you very briefly the importance of establishing credibility, trust in the predictive capability of models, because unless we have that trust, we're not going to be able to go anywhere. And we need to bring along those stakeholders who are uncertain about simulation, who don't know about simulation. So it's your job and my job to communicate the benefits and the utility of simulation and the power that's going to bring to transform this industry. So FDA's mission is to protect and promote public health, but we also have an equally important mission to facilitate innovation. And by doing that, we take charge of advancing regulatory science research. That's research geared towards the development of tools, methods, approaches to really improve the way that we evaluate products. And so that's really the thread throughout my talk this afternoon. Dr. Shurin is the Center Director for the Center for Devices of Radiological Health. That's where I work. He wants patients in the US to have access to safe, effective medical devices first in the world. That's a profound statement, because what that means for those of you who work in this space, that means we want to bring clinical trials, first in human trials. We want to bring those medical therapies here, even in their infancy stages, their experimental stages, so that patients, our patients, can get access to those therapies. But the way that we're going to do that is through facilitating innovation. This is a brief snapshot of CDRH. 1,800 people. We are a relatively small organization. FDA itself is about 15,000 people, so very similar to the size of Dassault. But if you look here, almost 200,000 medical devices are on the market in the United States. And we receive over 20,000 submissions each year. So those very 1,800 people have an extremely important job to do. And so some of the tools that we're going to talk about hopefully will help facilitate regulatory review and evaluation and development of devices. So for those of you that might not be familiar with medical devices, here's a snapshot of a broad range of devices, from very low-risk Class 1 exempt devices like surgical tools, Band-Aids, to diagnostic devices like glucose. You'll see the image there of the blood prick for checking your sugar levels, pregnancy tests, to high-risk devices, heart valves, hip replacements, ventricular assist devices. So all of these devices have a different benefit-risk profile to patients. And based on that, that dictates the amount of evidence we need to support the review of that device. So we get evidence from 4 different models. And yes, animals are models, bench tests are models, clinical studies are models. They have very controlled inclusion-exclusion criteria. So they are just a snapshot of the real-world population in which these devices will be deployed. And then we have computer models. So I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about that. And I'm going to refer to the output of simulation results or of algorithms or anything that comes from a computer as digital evidence, and you'll hear me use that term throughout. So when we think about these 4 models, they each have advantages and disadvantages, right? So this is a table that's color-coded to indicate a good advantage over some other models versus a poor advantage. So looking at predicting performance beyond the IFU, that's the indications for use. That's a statement about how this device is supposed to work. Well, we can't actually do that and test that in patients. So we can use simulation to really understand performance beyond what has been clinically tested. Adaptable for patient specificity. So in this industry renaissance, in the drive for using science to personalize medicine, we're not going to be able to do that in the clinic without having some insights from simulation to help dictate some of that. An area that we're working very closely with the SAOE on is this idea of, can we improve computer modeling to actually better predict clinical outcomes relevant to patients? So the concept of in silico clinical trials you hear about is really leveraging simulation to augment the need for clinical data in some areas. So there's a lot of different opportunities in the ways that simulation can impact medical devices. We can simulate the device, we can simulate anatomy, physiology, chemical toxicology. It's very rampant in the 3D additive manufacturing space, not just in patient-specific printed parts, but also understanding the printing process and optimizing it. Simulation can be embedded in a medical device. There can be complex algorithms. This is a snapshot of a glucose monitor where an artificial pancreas model can be used to predict when a patient might need insulin delivery and optimize the delivery to a patient. Simulation itself can be a medical device, and I'm going to talk about this just a bit more on the next slide. I'll even talk about treatment outcomes. I'm going to spend a moment about clinical trial for imaging systems and how we're using this in silico platform to actually potentially replace clinical studies for imaging systems. And I certainly need an entire conference to talk about real-world data and deep learning and machine learning to impact medical devices, so I won't touch on that today. What I want you to understand is that there are two major roles with respect to medical device submissions where simulation or digital evidence can play a role. So it can serve as scientific evidence of the medical device in question in a medical device application. Or itself can be a medical device, meaning that the software predicts something useful for a physician to make clinical decisions. In this particular example from HeartFlow, this is a computational fluid dynamics patient-specific simulation of blood flow in the coronary arteries. And the goal of this software is to tell a physician if the stenosis, the blockage in that artery, is severe enough for that patient to get a stent or get some kind of medical therapy. So that's a really important medical device in providing clinical decision-making. There's a whole category of devices that fall in this category of software as a medical device. And that's where these simulation tools fit under that category. And there is guidance that's happening globally from a community called the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. And that group brings together 12 regulatory bodies across the globe to harmonize on guidance in this particular space. It's still very early. Our group is focusing on digital health in this pre-certification program, which focuses on low-risk software as a medical device. But we have a lot of work to do if we want to use simulation to drive clinical decision-making. Some of the examples I'll talk about next are really on some ways that we can see different types of simulations in a submission. So we see computational solid mechanics, so your FEA. And this is really useful for when a company has a family of medical devices. They don't want to test all of their medical devices on the bench. That would be very costly and timely. So they can use these FEA tools like Simulia to figure out which device is going to perform the worst under some in vivo conditions, and then they can test those particular devices on the bench. So that's a way that we see FEA used very regularly. Computational electromagnetics is really important in the area of MR safety. So MR, if you go and have an MRI, what can happen when you're in that machine is radio frequency energy is created from the way the machine operates. Your body absorbs that energy. And what these models can help us do is understand if the human body would actually absorb too much energy and have a burn or some tissue damage. Now, if you have a medical device, it can actually act as an antenna and increase that amount of energy. So all of our medical devices use, the companies that have medical devices and patients, they want to be able to get an MRI, they have to use these tools to demonstrate that to us because we don't subject patients to that before we know for sure the device is MR safe. We use computational fluid dynamics, albeit not as much as the other tools because there's still a lot of complexities in simulating blood flow. For example, to understand blood damage like hemolysis or thrombosis, for those of you in that space. but it's really helpful in guiding the selection of parameters for bench testing and things like that. And also computational thermal analysis in the area of high-intensity focused ultrasound, where we're using ultrasound energy to ablate tumors, for example. It's really helpful that we use these tools to understand what is the potential impact of the tissue surrounding that tumor due to that high-intensity energy. So for the remaining part of the slides, I want to talk to you about different initiatives and activities that we have ongoing regarding simulation research at FDA, guidance. I'll spend really quite a bit of time on our partners because I think we can't do this in a silo. We really need to engage with stakeholders in this space, and I'll identify some specific examples in the area of in silico clinical trials. So this is the Office of Science and Engineering Laboratories. We're in Silver Spring, Maryland. We have about 130 research scientists in all different areas, physicists, mathematics, engineers, and we do research in a broad range of disciplines. And we have more than 36 projects involving computational modeling, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. This is one project that's been extremely popular in the community, whole body modeling, again for that electromagnetic simulations I was talking about regarding securing the safety of MRI machines. These models, they're available online, they can be downloaded, and you can use them in your regulatory submissions. And we've seen these models, they've been very successful in the area of electromagnetics. This is another area that might be of interest to the group. This is a very detailed head model that FDA developed in conjunction with some collaborators in the area to drive more advanced simulation for deep brain stimulation. One of the challenges is we need to identify and have models for all the unique structures in the brain in order to really understand the impact of DBS on those fine structures. And so this model is going to be really impactful for that kind of research. In the area of orthopedics, maybe some of you have heard of the metal-on-metal hip implant issue, where these metal components were undergoing micromotion and causing wear and then causing infections. So one of the things that we're doing now is trying to develop a tool to create a computational fretting map so we can understand if different types of implants might cause this micromotion and to avoid those designs in patients. This is where I'm going to spend at least a few minutes talking about. This is one of the 3 examples I'm going to share with you on the concept of in silico clinical trials. So this particular effort is called Victory, and the idea is that FDA started this initiative. The question came about when we look at traditional imaging studies and how they're put on the market. Many of them have to undergo very large clinical studies. So let's take the example of mammography. Most women over 40, one of the first things that happen is you go and you get a mammogram. It's screening for breast cancer. It's a 2D X-ray projection onto a flat surface, and a radiologist looks at it and tries to find lesions. So there's a new technology called digital breast tomosynthesis. And this device wanted to get on the market and say, we can be used as a screening tool as well. So FDA said, okay, a 450 patient study, 31 radiologists over the course of 4 years to do this study. So our FDA scientists, physicists, said, you know what, I think we can tackle this with computational modeling. So they actually developed an anthropomorphic model of the breast and of different types of lesions. They modeled the imaging system. The physics are very well known. Photon transport is very well characterized using simulation. They can actually take and model a reconstructed image of that breast model with or without a lesion. They actually can do computational reader studies. So the computational model serves as the radiologist to detect whether that image shows a lesion or not. So this group, over the course of 3 months, with tools that they had been developing for a decade, they ran a 1,000 patient virtual clinical study of all these different components. And their goal, their objective, was to say, can we arrive at the same regulatory conclusion about digital breast tomosynthesis as FDA did when they looked at the data from the clinical study? So that was their goal, that was their credibility mark. Can we achieve that? And they have just submitted the publication to the New England Journal of Medicine last week, and the short answer is yes, they did it. They hit all the marks in that clinical study with a completely in silico platform. Now where we are today, this in silico platform is not possible just yet in all areas of medical devices, but it's a really good first step to introduce to the clinical community that we have the power and the capability to use simulation to augment the need for subjecting patients to studies when we don't have to. So we have lots of research projects I mentioned going on at OSL, and I don't have a lot of time today to talk about all of them, but I just wanted you to be aware that we do research and we are very active in the simulation space. I actually heard in one of the sessions mention of the FDA guidance, so I'm really glad that people are using it, they know it exists. It's really just a guidance that says if you're going to use simulation in your regulatory submissions, here's what you should tell us about it. It's not going to mean you're necessarily successful. We have a lot more work to do there, but it's a good first step. So let's move on to partnerships, because we have a number to cover. So one of our partnerships is we want to reach out in the community and we want to engage in scientific dialogue about modeling and simulation. And so the Biomedical Engineering Society gives us a platform to do that. We bring together industry and government and regulatory bodies. In fact, it's one of the only conferences where you'll see 40+ FDA people. That's common for a clinical meeting, but not a scientific meeting to talk about simulation. Our next conference in 2019 is focusing on the role of digital evidence to support personalized patient healthcare. So I hope to get to see some of you there. MDIC, maybe some of you have heard of this public-private partnership. The Medical Device Innovation Consortium started in 2014 with the sole purpose to help advance regulatory science and to create a forum where FDA can work directly with industry on projects that were relevant to both stakeholders, in addition to other stakeholders like other government agencies and patient groups. One of the projects around modeling and simulation was really focused at changing the way we think about digital evidence in our regulatory decision making. So the pie on the left-hand side depicts where we are today. That realistically, computer modeling and simulation does not play a driving role in regulatory decision making, but we want it to. We want to lessen the burden of evidence in clinical trials and animal studies, right? We want to do the work that's necessary, not the work that we think is needed just because that's what we've done for 20 years. So we have to change that paradigm. So one of the ways that we did that with this group was demonstrating the concept of in silico clinical trials to industry and to FDA. So let's think about physical modeling. So we're really good at doing this kind of modeling. Anatomy, physiology, understanding use conditions. If we know what the use conditions are, we probably can simulate them. And we're really good at simulating medical devices. They're hunks of metals with electronics and all these small parts. You guys are good at that. We're also getting better with using statistical tools to incorporate uncertainty and large amounts of variability. So if we can marry these two together, then we can think about the concept of in silico clinical trials, where we can have cohorts of patients that we can rely on for maybe it's just one piece of clinical information, but maybe that one piece means we don't have to have 10 or 20 or 30 extra patients in a study to answer that question, but we can use simulation to drive that. And this isn't just me, a scientist, talking about this. Our center director, Jeff Shuren, and the director of clinical studies, Owen Ferris, published a paper last year in the New England Journal of Medicine, highlighting two key points for me. One is on this slide, one is on the next. They specifically called out the idea of using virtual patients. And you'll see it says in a precisely defined way. So this is really important. This isn't saying we're just going to use models or create virtual people and just use them haphazardly. We have to define precisely what that means. And then if we can show that it's good enough as compared to an actual patient, then let's use it. So they're all for it. One of the other areas they talked about is my second example of in silico medicine that we're being involved in. So we worked very closely with Medtronic for a number of years to set up a paradigm for how we were going to establish medical devices, like a pacemaker, to be MRI safe. So again, if I'm a patient with an implant, can I go have an MRI? I'm actually a sick patient. I need an MRI, but I have this medical device that's prohibiting that. So what do I do? So for 5 years, Medtronic invested in developing phantoms with FDA, working on animal modeling, validating their computational models with animal studies, and then moving into the clinic and simulating not just the device and the patient with the device, but the actual MRI machine. And through that investment and creating that paradigm, they now can have they had their most recent pacemaker approved as MRI safe with no clinical data. No clinical data. These studies were typically a couple hundred patient confirmatory studies. and now the other companies are investing. So this is another way where we can use simulation to augment the need for clinical data. And this is my third example. So through the MDIC mock submission team, where MDIC said, you know what, we're going to take this physical modeling and these statistical modeling, we're going to show FDA how we can do this virtual patient. So a virtual patient is really just described as a way we can use simulation to augment clinical information. And the way that we did this here was with this cardiac pacemaker lead. It's for those of you who don't know, the pacemaker can help pace the heart if the heart has an arrhythmia or does not have a normal heart rhythm. And the way that that electrical activity is delivered to the heart is through a lead, this very long wire. And if that wire breaks, then the electrical activity doesn't get to the heart, and so then the patient can't get paced appropriately. So this is a really important endpoint. So what we said was, well, we can physically model the lead. Really, that's something we can do really well. We also know the use conditions. We can simulate variability in activity levels, in the geometry, in the material properties. Those are things we can do really well. So what we did was we proposed using an adaptive Bayesian statistical framework, which MDIC is now calling the virtual patient discount model. Terrible name, I know, but they're working on that. All of this information is publicly available on the MDIC website with those links there. What we said to FDA was, look, we can simulate 1,000 cohorts of 1,000 patients and create what the freedom from fracture survival curves look like. And we were able to capture real clinical data in that window. And so we convinced the FDA that for a new pacemaker lead, if you're doing a next generation lead, it's about a 500-person clinical study. And they said, we want to borrow from our virtual patient cohort 50 patients. And after some back and forth and different submissions and talking about the credibility of the model and the predictions, they said yes. And they said yes in a public way where you can go and download that letter and those details about how we can use this platform. So this is our example number 3. Now, it was a mock submission, which means it wasn't real. And so when we look to these 3 different examples, we have a case study where FDA was working with partners to say, here's in silico approach for imaging systems, which there was a real clinical study, and we created that clinical study with in silico methods. Then we worked with industry to now just rely on a modeling platform to no longer need clinical evidence for showing that devices are MR safe. And now we have this other example of, here's a way that if a company can identify a specific endpoint that we can simulate really well, and that we can do that with great confidence, then why can't we use simulation to augment that endpoint and lower the burden of clinical studies? So this was a relatively simple example in that the model was not very complex. So now we want to move and leverage another important partnership, and that's with Dassault through the Living Heart Project. So now we're thinking, how can we move this to another device area? How can we take this Living Heart platform and think about another example of in silico clinical trials? Maybe one where we actually simulate the device and functional endpoints and demonstrate that we can do this in silico clinical trial again. And maybe, now this is a really new idea for us, can we also think about a new way to present that information to FDA? So the way that information is presented to us right now is a PDF, e-copy, follow these rules and tell us, send us all this documentation. Really horrible stuff if you're a reviewer. Like, you just sit down with your cup of coffee and you get through all these papers. And you probably miss something, right? Because by the end, after 45 minutes or so, you're tired. So what if we could think about a submission of the future? What if we could use the 3D Experience platform and show FDA a new way of saying, here's how we present the model, here's how we present the data, here's how we present the device, and I can somehow experience it. I don't know what that looks like yet. I need you guys to help with that. But maybe that could be one of the objectives of our project, and not just showing a different example of in silico clinical studies, which will be very important. But maybe along the same lines, we can use these sophisticated tools to show industry and FDA what's really possible. So I look forward to that collaboration. And I also wanted to add, it's not just for medical devices, right? Many of you heard some examples of the Living Heart model being used for pharmaceuticals in the arrhythmia space. So if we can demonstrate this on the medical device side, because the medical device center is very interested in silico studies, can we bring our colleagues in pharmaceuticals at CEDAR along? Well, our commissioner surely thinks so. Just a couple weeks ago, he published a statement. And for those of you who don't know, Dr. Gottlieb is really good with social media, and he posts all of his remarks when he goes to a conference, and he gives remarks. They're all available online, so go to fda.gov and check it out. This is a formal post where he talked about how CEDAR is going to modernize the review of drugs. And he specifically calls out modeling and simulation in his remarks, 4th paragraph down. And the adoption of better tools. Well, you guys are a really great software tool provider. You know, let's think about a way to change that experience for other products. And then partners again. So this is really important. So we're going to rely on digital evidence to augment clinical studies or to make regulatory decisions. What's the bar for that? How do we figure out what credibility looks like? What verification and validation looks like? So there's this standards organization, ASME, where their goal is to create standards and methodologies for assessing accuracy and credibility of models. And there are 6 subcommittees, and there's one focused on medical devices. And in that subcommittee, there are 43 voting members. For any of you working in consensus standards knows that 43 is a lot of people to get to say yes. And these 43 people voted on this standard that's coming out this summer. And this standard is focused on not how to do verification and validation. There's a lot of work in that domain. But how do you figure out the bar? Not everybody needs to perform at the same level. For every single model, we're using models to answer different questions. So the verification and validation evidence really should align with how that model is being used. And so that's what this guideline, this standard talks about. And of course, industry says, well, that's this 90-page document. How are we going to sift through that? So we're leading, FDA is working on a new work item with ASME to do a different mock submission where we're saying, here's how you actually show FDA how to use simulation in your application for initiating a clinical study. So we've actually developed FDA. We ponied up $250,000 to develop 2 models, one for solid mechanics, one for fluid dynamics, where the goal is to say we want to initiate a clinical study using these models and no bench testing. Of course, those models have to be validated, and that requires some bench testing. But we're going to demonstrate to the industry in partnership with industry. So we have 4 companies who are on board, and not just 4 companies that have modelers, but 4 companies that have also offered their regulatory affairs people to engage with us on what this submission will look like. So this is an ongoing activity, and I hope in the future to share with you the outcomes of that. This is almost my last slide. I'm sorry, I've gone over a minute. So I mainly talked about using simulation to help get devices on the market, you know, in the regulatory submission or, you know, getting clinical evidence, but there's so much more, and I know that you guys are on the cutting edge of this concept of product lifecycle management. How do we use simulation in that continuous improvement of our products? Not just to get it on the market and say, great, I made my money, it's out on the market, good for me, but thinking about that digital transformation, digital evidence in the whole process. So tomorrow I'm really excited to get to have a panel with Dan Matlis from Ascendia. So we're going to talk about what FDA is doing in the area of digital transformation and digital evidence. So come and check that out. And these are my closing remarks. So I hope you leave today with saying FDA is doing research in simulation, and they really want us to use simulation to augment clinical studies. That's really great. I'm going to tell people about that. But it's going to take work. It's going to take work to show the level of credibility needed, the V&V evidence to say this model's good enough. So we're working on that. And partnerships. We really can't do this in a silo. So we're really excited to be here and to engage with all of you. And I appreciate your attention, and I look forward to connecting with those I haven't connected with yet. Thank you.